Welcome, everyone, to another episode of 26.1 AI Podcast, where we have an old friend of mine, not so old, but I've known him for over 17 years, Ian Bicking. And if you're familiar with the Python world or Mozilla world or many other things, you probably have heard his name. And it's a very honor to have you on as our guest today, Ian.
Hi, it's great to be here. Thanks.
So, to kick it off, and I'm here with my co host, Don Shu, as well, as always. Well, most times at least. Well, to kick it off, Ian, let's just a little bit, real quick for the audience. Can you talk about your progression all the way from Earlham to where you're at now in 30 seconds or less?
Yeah, so I've been very involved in open source for a long time. I was at Mozilla for about 10 years in Mozilla Labs until that was shut down, and management for a while, and Test Pilot, another experimental project, kind of incubator, until that was shut down. And then recently moved to consumer voice products in the emerging technologies group, uh, where we were kind of exploring how to apply voice and natural language things to new products and to the web. Um, and I was with that until that was shut down. So I've been through many different labs like incubators at Mozilla over the last 10 years until this last one.
Firefox Voice, you debuted that fairly recently, didn't you?
Yes, so Firefox Voice is a voice assistant that we built for the browser. Um, and yeah, we've been doing kind of like internal releases and friendly, friends and family kind of releases, and did kind of some more public releases just in the past few months of that.
So, what was the impetus of the voice? Was it just to keep up with some of the other innovations in AI, or where was the source of the idea? Do you know?
So Mozilla has several voice projects. Um, One that is continuing on is Common Voice, and that's kind of a crowdsourced uh, opportunity for people to come in and give their own voice samples and create training data. And that training data is open source, so anyone can use that. Um, so there's Common Voice. Another one is Deep Speech, um, and that is a deep learning framework for speech recognition, as well as another one for speech generation. The Well, that's just text to speech, TTS. And then these were kind of interesting technologies, and then we have to put them together and try to make something out of them. And so that's where the consumer voice product um, team came in. So really trying to apply some of the technologies that had already been worked on.
So, and catching me up a little bit here, we've only had a couple times to catch up, and we usually talk about other things. So, I remember you very, very involved, always very uh, active with your blogging and talking about all your ideas, but very involved in the Python community, and then transitioning out of it at one point to be in Mozilla. Um, and now kind of in this world of AI a little bit as well. What is the impetus of your change in your path? What is your what usually steers you in another direction? Is it demand, or is it what gets you wanting to move to another area? Boredom, whatever.
Yeah, I'm excited about new things. I did a lot of open source for a long time, and that's how I came to Mozilla. But in some ways, that was always like getting to building up all the pieces, all the the building blocks for something else. So I think as I came to realize that, I've been focusing more on like what do we actually use these building blocks for. So yeah, the last several years have been much more about kind of um, applied things and things that users can really use and if possible can change the way people use computers, um, which is what what brought me to the voice team as well. You know, it's a opportunity to think about a new space, one that hasn't existed before, and you know, the world has not decided exactly what voice interfaces should be like, and there's just like a lot of intersecting things to consider,
Well,
which is where I enjoy being.
well, the ones that are leading mindshare right now, Alexa and Google Assistant, they scare me. We're talking about two companies that are entirely dependent on attention economy, and they have all the motivations to do wrong with the data that they're collecting. So that's one of the fascinating things about this project that Mozilla pursued it, is for me at least.
Yeah. At the same time, I'm actually quite positive about voice. Like, we use Alexa quite a bit at home, and that's been very useful just to understand what these experiences are like as well. Um, and while there is that privacy angle, at the same time, voice interfaces to me feel more humane than a lot of other interfaces. They don't try to get you to scroll further. They don't interrupt you unless you ask them for something. Um, they're really much more of a relationship that feels much more healthy, right? Like if you're using a voice assistant, you're doing so in public. You're not like entering this private world in, you know, when there's a bunch of people and one person looks at a phone, like you don't know why. But if you're interacting with voice, like it doesn't break down that social connection. So like the privacy issue is still there, but like from a social perspective, I really think it has a lot of positives.
I I think it's hugely important. Um, the example I offer is my spouse. She's not a big tech user. She may have called 3 lifts on her own using an app. She may use a total of 3 apps ever. Yet when she interacts for search, she prefers voice on her phone. And I hear so many stories from friends with children. A lot of them are interacting with tech through voice.
Hmm.
And I think it's hugely important. And I get what you're saying about it being a more humane interface, though you have some opinions about etiquette with voice assistants.
Yeah, I guess I've been trying to figure out how to describe it, but I mean, there's a debate. Is it okay for people to kind of like yell at their assistant or to be um, impolite or even like, you know, Siri does have certain reactions if you swear at her, right? Um, and here I am calling it her, even though obviously it's not a person. Um, and there are like a lot of people who feel like this is kind of make us more cold. There's some questions about like the gender of these voice assistants and whether we're inviting certain kinds of interactions. Um, that's some place where I think both we have to be aware, because there is going to be an emotional reaction when people are going to use voice that's different than other mediums. One thing user researchers at Mozilla found is, for instance, when people were doing voice search on their phones, and they had an accent and they couldn't get it to understand, uh, they took it much more personally. It was like, there's something wrong with me because I'm not able to interact with this in a way that I don't think like typing on your keyboard and having problems with that is going to have that same emotional reaction.
Well, I don't know. I
So,
don't know. I've been pretty hard on my keyboard before.
yeah. But I think it's in part it's our job not to like, we should be aware of that, but we should also try to remove some of the emotional impact instead of uh, building on it, right? Like we should make it clear that the thing you're interacting with doesn't have feelings and can't have its feelings hurt, um, because that's the truth, you know, behind it, and that's kind of something that we have to work towards, and I think a lot of people like see that emotional reaction and then they're kind of excited to make use of it, and that's where I think we need to like really hold ourselves back. Um, that making use of it is I think the more morally questionable issue there.
Hmm.
So I saw Social Dilemma, I think it's called, and our friend Aza Raskin was on there from I'm sure in the Python community we both interacted,
Yeah.
um, and then I didn't realize he invented infinite scroll, and I got onto the wiki page for it, and he apologized to the world for inventing infinite scroll, and I'm wondering if we're going to apologize for creating uh, voice interfaces and things like that later, where people just become so more likely to talk to their robot than they do their spouse.
Yeah. One of the dangers is that the reason that it's not emotionally manipulative on voice is just because we haven't figured out how to do that yet. And once we do, then capitalism knows how to make use of things. Um, and so maybe it's just a question of maturity. Uh, but it's also our responsibility to keep that from happening again.
Is this a segue into bringing in GPT-3 into the conversation and what's going to happen with that with voice?
I don't know. What do you think is going to happen with?
I listened to your conversation about it on a podcast, and you have some critiques already about that platform, right?
Yeah, somebody took my. I wrote a blog post recently about voice interfaces, and someone took that and used it as a, I don't know, is seed the right word for a GPT-3 thing, and then basically like came up with an AI generated version of the blog post or something, which was like it brought up all these terms and like it kept having these like it was like hot take after hot take of like interesting ways to put it together ideas about voice, except none of it meant anything. Right, it was all fakery, and there was no belief behind it, and nobody was actually making an assertion that anything was true. But it was really hard to read because um, you can read like just word salad and you can do something with that, but if you're reading something that really seems to be making salient points, it's hard not to try to do something with that. And that's what GPT-3 felt like to me in that way, and some of the other places I've encountered it. It's it gets in your head, but it can't actually say anything because it doesn't actually believe anything.
Sounds like it's a simulation of putting us through what a first year college composition teacher has to go through.
Oh, there's going to be so many college essays written by GPT-3. I I would not want to grade them.
So I took a peek at, and I have to admit, I've probably been listening to your blog before I even knew what blogs were. I think your blog was the first blog I ever really read in my life, to be honest with you. But I did take a peek at the recent edition of that, talking about the different projects and things you might be wanting to dabble in or work on. Has any of those floated to the top, or what is your main focus right now?
Well, since I was laid off and I have some time, I am hoping to be more playful than productive. Um, I've been I, being with Mozilla for so long. I spent a lot of time trying to um, align my creative impulses with the strategic needs and political realities of Mozilla. Um, and those projects are my attempt to unwind unwind that, at least those potential projects, to decide what it is that I want to do, purely as my own desire.
And
So
I think
yes,
about
lots of
your
playful things.
prior inventions, and I remember you came to me once mentioning the enormous popularity of virtual env, which was your invention in the Python world. And you said to me, Brian, it's just a simple script, and I've written things that were I put tons more thought into than this stupid script. And why is this one the one that becomes so popular?
Yeah, we don't get to choose, and sometimes I don't know. Over and over, I've learned that like solving smaller problems tends to lead to much more popularity than coming up with like sophisticated, large, complex solutions to ambiguous problems. Um, Maybe I'll learn that lesson, or maybe I'll just keep making large, ambiguous things.
Maybe a more thorough context on virtual env and what happened.
So virtualenv and pip are two projects I started a long time ago. They become kind of the standard installation tools for a lot of Python work. virtualenv is something that gives you kind of like a isolated Python environment. Before that, people were often installing things globally, and so if you had two projects, you'd get like two sets of libraries, and they'd all get mixed up together, and you couldn't get rid of them, and everyone was doing slightly different combinations that nobody could debug each other's like installation paths. So virtualenv was something that was actually started by uh, Philip Eby, as well as a lot of what came into pip as well. Um, was started by him as part of packaging, and then I liked his ideas, and I saw how people were not liking were not liking his ideas. I thought like these are good ideas, and so basically like those were me taking the ideas he had and some of the stuff he had done, and then like packaging it up in a way that um, satisfied people's I don't know desires and aesthetics a little bit better. Uh, so as I said, like I don't feel um, they're kind of my biggest contributions, but not the ones that I'm proudest about. So it puts me in an odd place. I mean, I'm happy with them, and I'm glad that they've helped people out. But
If you want to revisit packaging for the Python community, I mean, there's no end of work there.
yeah, right now what I think and what's something that looking back on it that I did put a lot of effort into, which I don't think I deserves some like thought, is advocating for those tools and sometimes even like saying like don't use that thing, use my thing, because there were a bunch of like competing ideas and different ways about going about things at that time, uh, and I think Python is a lot better off because there isn't a ton of different ways to do that. But there's like this next level, right? Like how do you compose an application? How do you like manage your environments? You have a bunch of different tools around that. And right now, I think the thing the Python community needs to do is make some decisions, including maybe like some less friendly decisions, and someone needs to like stand up and say, no, this is the right way to do it, and I'm gonna really
Do
advocate
you
for it.
still lurk on the
Um,
Python lists?
no, I've yeah, I'm not really part of the Python community anymore. All my work has been in JavaScript for some
Yeah.
time.
Yeah, that was interesting that when you diverged from that. And you don't have to speak on too much why, but I certainly know, and Don does too, of many controversies in the Python community, which seem unfortunate.
Well, I think that happens in all the different communities. Um, in the Python world, I you and I know those discussions quite well, but I mean, I have friends in the JavaScript community that I enjoy interacting with and learning about how they interact, and I've been making a lot of friends in the Scala community lately, and they're really different, but they have a lot of cool stuff going on too.
I mean, it's just amazing the brilliance in Mozilla, and I treat Mozilla as its own thing. Maybe I shouldn't, and maybe it's just like any other open source project hub. But I see it as having a lot of brilliance. It was just in an extremely competitive space. I think that was the hardest part of it. But you were there and you lived it. What was the difference between the Python community and the Mozilla community and Apache? And what are the differences between these communities?
I mean, Mozilla is really a corporation, and people work there, and they have jobs. So that's very different from the Python community. Uh, I think it's different than other places in that there really is a strong shared mission. It's different than other maybe like corporate environments, um, and a lot of a lot of shared expectations about how software works and how you include people in the community and all those sorts of things. But Mozilla does have to be a corporation with people who have jobs and make sure that the download servers are up and make sure that the marketing campaigns go out and all that kind of stuff, which is different than an open source community, and something I having seen that, I feel like there's a lot of opportunity that we're never going to be able to achieve in other open source projects, because actually like distributing large software projects like that requires all those jobs, and the open source community can't just get volunteers to do all that work. And um, it's hampered us, as hampered us as an open source community. We haven't been able to produce works on the same size and with the same impact. Instead, we tend to make libraries that we give to other people, and then they turn them into commercial applications, and they do all that work. So, yeah, we're not bringing it to the people as a result.
Are there precautionary tales with the open source world and even AI? I always kind of like to ask about what are your fears? Do you have any fears about how people use open source or how people use AI?
Um, I mean, I remain both positive and skeptical about open source. I think we have created something that really increases the value of developers, and it shows in kind of the way developers are treated and compensated. Uh, I'm not sure that we have created, the original kind of free software dream was about this being a more societal change, and I don't think we are achieving that. Um, and with sometimes it feels like open source is kind of like a charity towards developers. Um, AI, a lot of the open source is in the tooling, and then the application is done by another company or part of something else. Um, so it's replicating that same thing where the openness is empowering to the people who have the resources to make use of it. Um, and I don't know what the solution there is. So one of them might be open data. That's something um, that Mozilla, and I think the Mozilla Foundation is going to kind of be continuing to work on. That's something Common Voice is trying to do for voice data. Um, that might democratize some of the work. Um, but even if you democratize the data, because we don't have a process to actually kind of bring running code to the people in open source, it's still going to be the applications that those technologies are going to be kind of controlled and not shared as well as they might be. So I think that's some of my concern.
Going back to Common Voice, I read it's got something over 1,000 hours of voice data. Was that enough for Firefox Voice to be competitive for what you needed it to do?
Well, so deep speech, the speech recognition engine in Mozilla um, uses kind of a variety of data. I'm sure they use some from Common Voice, but a lot of it is from what is it, Libra something. I'm trying to remember the name, but it's basically a bunch of people reading public domain. LibriVox is a lot of people reading public domain books. So audiobooks from the public domain from 100 years ago. The recordings are not 100 years old. The recordings are all done with nice high quality microphones, and the text is 100 years old. And so that was actually quite a problem for us. So we were using Google transcription so that we could kind of explore the process, and then we were kind of simultaneously testing it with deep speech on the back end, just to see how the two compared and how they were doing. But in terms of being able to understand in noisy environments, again, LibriVox is people speaking into microphones and not someone, with an air conditioning next to them and an open microphone. And then also in terms of understanding current speech, there was a lot of issues around that. So it turns out, in Firefox Voice, we were doing a browser voice assistant, and the use cases there are actually not that different than a home voice assistant, and it's mostly people doing little searches and then doing like basic controls, playing music or something like that. And those searches, they are just full of very timely information, and lots of proper nouns, lots of names of places. So that requires a very up-to-date language model to be able to do accurately, and that's a big challenge. And Google obviously has access to more information about the things people are talking about and searching for than anybody, and it shows in the quality of the product. So, yeah.
Well, to kind of wrap up this session, how best can people find you? What's the I probably know three ways, but how would you like people to find you?
My webpage and other places, I am ianbicking.org or Ian Bicking on Twitter. And yeah.
Oh, thanks. It was really great catching up with you. We need to catch up more often.
Thank you for joining, Ian.